The Russian corvette was supposed to be a message. The Staragushi-class warship Stoiky, hull number 545, 3,400 tons of Russian naval steel, had pulled into the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas in February under the banner of an exercise the Kremlin had named, with characteristic subtlety, Maritime Security Belt 2026. The exercises were joint: Russia, China, and Iran. 3 navies, 1 body of water, 1 signal aimed directly at Washington. The signal was not subtle. The signal was that the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, the entire choke point through which a fifth of the world's seaborne oil moves every single day, was no longer a body of water the United States Navy could treat as its own. Russia had a corvette there. China had warships transiting. Iran had its IRGC speedboats, its Shahed drones, its anti-ship ballistic missiles. The combined message, broadcast through Russian state television and Iranian state media and amplified across every Chinese-aligned outlet from Beijing to Caracas, was that the era of unilateral American maritime power in the Gulf had ended. That message was the entire point of the deployment. That message was what the Stoiky was there to deliver. And then, 3 months later, the United States Navy did something to that message that nobody in Moscow, nobody in Tehran, and almost nobody in Washington's own foreign policy commentariat believed Washington still had the institutional nerve to do. The U.S. Navy ignored it. If you are not subscribed to this channel yet, fix that right now before we go any further into what just happened in those waters. We track the great power dimension of the Iran war the way no other channel does. Every Russian movement, every Chinese hedge, every American move that exposes the gap between what these regimes claim and what they can actually defend. Tap subscribe, hit the bell, turn on notifications. Because what just happened to Russia in the Strait of Hormuz is the most consequential piece of geopolitical theater of the entire war. And you are going to want the full picture. Pull back from the corvette and look at what was actually happening in those waters in the weeks after the Stoiky arrived. Because the choreography only becomes legible once you assemble it. On the 26th of March, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi announced that the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran had closed to American and Israeli shipping in the opening days of the war, would be reopened to the vessels of 5 specific nations: China, India, Iraq, Pakistan, and Russia. The list was not coincidence. The list was a public reciprocation of the Maritime Security Belt deployment. Iran was saying, in the only language that matters in this kind of confrontation, that the great powers protecting it would be granted the access the regime denied to its enemies. Russia, in particular, was being given a symbolic waiver, confirmation that the warship at Bandar Abbas had purchased a permanent operational privilege in the strait. 3 weeks later, on April 13th at 10 o'clock Eastern Time, U.S. Central Command issued a statement that erased that privilege as if it had never existed. The blockade, CENTCOM said, would be enforced impartially against vessels of all nations entering or departing Iranian ports. Impartially. Against vessels of all nations. Read that sentence twice, because the sentence is the entire story. The United States Navy was not exempting Russia. The United States Navy was not creating a special channel for maritime security belt participants. The United States Navy was treating the Russian deployment, the Russian warship at Bandar Abbas, the Russian foreign minister's statements about strategic partnership, and Iran's symbolic granting of transit rights as completely irrelevant to the operational facts on the ground. And in case anyone in Moscow missed the point, what came next removed the last of the ambiguity. Within the first 24 hours of the blockade, more than 10,000 U.S. personnel, supported by more than a dozen warships and dozens of aircraft, were enforcing the operation. 6 commercial ships were redirected back to Iranian ports without a single incident. By April 18th, the number of intercepted vessels had risen to 23. By the time the Pentagon disclosed the operational costs publicly, Iran had lost $4.8 billion in oil revenue between April 13th and May 1st. 31 tankers carrying 53 million barrels were stranded in the Gulf. Not one Russian warship moved to interfere. Not one Russian-flagged escort attempted to break the blockade. The Stoichi, the maritime security belt, the entire architecture of the great power protective umbrella that Moscow had spent 3 months building around Iran in the lead up to this exact moment. None of it touched the operational reality of what the U.S. Navy was doing in the water. The corvette was still at Bandar Abbas. The blockade was still in force. The cargo was still being turned around. And the symbolism that maritime security belt was supposed to deliver had been, in the most public way possible, revealed to be exactly that: symbolism. History was watching this moment with the kind of attention historians reserve for events that mark the end of one strategic era and the beginning of another. Because the United States has done a version of this before, against a different great power, in a different body of water, on a different continent. And the parallel is so exact that it ought to be taught in every diplomatic academy from this year forward. October 22nd, 1962. President John F. Kennedy went on national television and announced a naval quarantine of Cuba in response to the Soviet deployment of nuclear-capable missiles 90 miles from the American coast. Soviet ships, including vessels carrying additional missile components, were already steaming toward the island. The Soviet Union, under General Secretary Nikita Khrushchev, had positioned the Cuban deployment as a strategic equalizer, a demonstration that the era of unilateral American hemispheric dominance had ended, that Moscow could project power into Washington's own backyard, that any American counteraction would risk direct great power confrontation. The U.S. Navy formed a quarantine line in the Atlantic. American warships were ordered to stop, board, and turn back any Soviet vessel attempting to deliver military cargo to Cuba. And on October 24th, with Soviet ships closing on the quarantine line, the entire world watched to see whether Khrushchev would call the bluff or whether Washington would. Khrushchev turned his ships around. The quote attributed to Secretary of State Dean Rusk that morning has become diplomatic shorthand for the entire incident. We were eyeball to eyeball, and the other fellow just blinked. The lesson delivered that week in international waters off the coast of Cuba was the lesson every great power's general staff has had to relearn periodically ever since. A blockade is not a piece of paper. A blockade is a question. The question is whether the challenging power values its strategic posture more than it values avoiding direct confrontation with the United States Navy. The answer in 1962 was that Moscow did not. The answer in 2026 has been the same. The Stoichi did not move. The Russian Navy did not test the blockade line. The maritime security belt did not become a maritime security wall. The question was asked in April. The answer was delivered by silence. And the silence is the entire story. Because what Khrushchev's blink did to the Soviet Union's strategic credibility for the rest of the decade is exactly what the silence in the Gulf is doing to Vladimir Putin's strategic credibility right now. Take a moment and tell me in the comments what you think Russia's actual next move is. Does Moscow accept the humiliation and pivot to vertical escalation in Ukraine to recover lost ground? Does the Kremlin quietly withdraw the Stoichi and pretend the deployment was always a goodwill exercise? Or does Putin do what Soviet leadership did after the Cuban climb down? Absorb the loss publicly, accelerate covert capabilities elsewhere, and wait for a moment of American distraction to test the line again. The strategic analysis under these videos has been some of the sharpest I see anywhere on this topic. Drop your read below before we get to the deeper layer. Now, go deeper. Because what makes the 2026 humiliation strategically worse than 1962 is what it reveals about the current condition of Russian power that the Cuban climb down did not yet expose about Soviet power. In 1962, the Soviet Union turned its ships around because Khrushchev concluded that direct nuclear confrontation with Washington was a price the regime could not pay. The decision was rational. The decision was strategic. The decision left the Soviet Union diminished but intact. In 2026, Vladimir Putin's decision not to contest the blockade is not strategic in that sense. It is structural. It is the visible surface of constraints the Russian Federation has been trying to hide for 2.5 years. and that the Iran war has now stripped naked. Constraint 1. The Russian Navy itself has been catastrophically degraded by the Ukraine war. The Black Sea Fleet, which was supposed to be the projection force for any Eastern Mediterranean or Persian Gulf contingency, has lost its flagship, Moskva, lost multiple Kilo-class submarines, lost the operational ability to enter the Sea of Azov uncontested, and has been forced to relocate large parts of its surface fleet from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk to escape Ukrainian sea drone strikes. The Russian Navy, that Maritime Security Belt 2026 was supposed to demonstrate as a global player, is the same Navy that cannot operate freely in its own home waters. Constraint 2. Russia's economic capacity to back deployments with sustained operations has collapsed. The Caspian corridor that supplied the Russian war machine through Iranian drone production has been hit at both ends by Israeli and Ukrainian strikes. The general license easing U.S. sanctions on Russian oil that was supposed to provide a financial windfall during the Iran war has been undermined by Ukraine's destruction of Russian refining infrastructure. The ruble is under structural pressure that the Iran war has accelerated rather than relieved. Constraint 3. Putin is simultaneously attempting to manage a delayed summit with the Trump administration that the Kremlin views as essential to extracting any sanctions relief on the Ukraine front. Vertical escalation against the U.S. Navy in the Gulf would torch that summit before it occurs. The Trump-Xi meeting in May has already received Beijing's calculated political deference. Moscow does not have the option of a similar climb down without admitting that climb down is what it is doing. So the Russian response has been the worst of every available world. The corvette stays. The blockade holds. The maritime security belt rhetoric continues to circulate on Russian state media. And the operational reality in the water demonstrates, for any observer paying attention, that Russian protective rhetoric in the Gulf has been falsified in real time, with consequences that extend far beyond this single confrontation. The damage to Russian deterrent posture is permanent and the only way that matters. Once a great power has been observed to back down without contesting a blockade aimed at its declared partner, the credibility of all of its other protective commitments, to Belarus, to Armenia until recently, to Syria's remaining factions, to its proxy networks across Africa and the Middle East, degrades by a measurable amount that no amount of state media can repair. And the consequences of that degradation are landing far outside Moscow, in places that did not anticipate having to recalibrate around a humiliated Russia. Global marine insurance markets have repriced Iran-related routes at premiums not seen since the tanker war of the 1980s, with rates for ships transiting the Gulf of Oman approaching levels that make small flag state operators, Liberia, Panama, the Marshall Islands, Malta, calculate whether they can absorb the cost of incidents that Russia's protective posture was supposed to prevent. The MSC Francesca, a Liberia-flagged cargo vessel, and the Epaminondas, a Panama-flagged tanker, have already been seized by Iran in retaliation for the U.S. blockade. And Russia, which under any plausible reading of the maritime security belt was supposed to provide some form of deterrent against exactly this kind of Iranian escalation, has done nothing. The Russian Navy did not escort. The Russian Foreign Ministry did not threaten. The Russian state did not even pretend to consider intervening on behalf of vessels caught in the dispute. Small flag state operators are now calculating whether the Russian protective umbrella, which they were quietly relying on as a hedge against full Iranian aggression, exists at all. The answer they are arriving at is the answer the stoicy demonstrated by sitting silently at Bandar Abbas while the U.S. Navy intercepted 23 vessels and turned 6 others around without firing a shot. The umbrella does not exist. The umbrella was never going to exist at the operational scale Russian rhetoric implied. And the global shipping economy, which had quietly internalized Russian Gulf presence as a partial counterbalance to American power, is now repricing the entire risk profile of Persian Gulf trade in ways that will continue to land in container costs, in fuel surcharges, in the price of fertilizer and agricultural markets from Brazil to Vietnam, for months and possibly years after this particular confrontation has been resolved. Which brings us to the question that the planners in every capital from Moscow to Beijing to Tel Aviv are now asking simultaneously. What does Russia actually do from here? There are really only three paths, and Putin's choices are tightening faster than the Russian information apparatus can manage the narrative around them. The first path is vertical escalation. Moscow, calculating that the humiliation in the Gulf is more strategically corrosive than the costs of forcing a confrontation elsewhere, accelerates operations in Ukraine to recover lost ground. Increased Shahed strikes on Ukrainian power infrastructure, ground operations against Ukrainian positions in the east, hybrid attacks against NATO-adjacent infrastructure, intended to demonstrate that Russian power can still inflict costs on someone, even if it cannot inflict them on the U.S. Navy. The cost of this path is that it accelerates exactly the dynamics that produced the humiliation in the first place. The Caspian corridor cannot be replaced quickly. The Iranian drone supply chain cannot be reconstituted at scale while Iran is itself under blockade. Vertical escalation without restored supply lines is escalation that exhausts itself faster than it produces results. The second path is strategic retreat. Russia quietly withdraws the Stoichi under cover of the joint exercise concluding, allows the maritime security belt rhetoric to fade from Russian media, accepts the loss of the great power protector role in the Gulf, and pivots Moscow's diplomatic energy toward extracting concessions on Ukraine in exchange for not interfering with the U.S.-Iran campaign. This is the path the Russian General Staff appears to have already chosen operationally, and it is the path the Trump administration has structured the Iran war to encourage. The cost is generational. Once Russia has been observed to back down from a Gulf protector role, the regional powers that hedged around Russian presence, Algeria, Libya, parts of the Sahel, recalculate. The third path is the long game. Russia accepts the immediate humiliation, accelerates covert capabilities, submarines, hypersonic missile platforms, autonomous undersea systems, and waits for a moment when the U.S. Navy is distracted by another theater to test the line again from a position of recovered capability. This is the path Soviet leadership chose after Cuba in 1962, and it produced a generation of investment in the very strategic capabilities that eventually made the Cold War the contest it became. The 2026 version of this path is constrained, however, by the fact that Russia simply does not have the industrial base or the foreign currency reserves to fund the kind of multi-decade rebuild the Soviet Union could fund in the 1960s. The covert capabilities will accelerate. They will not, on any realistic timeline, restore what the silence at Bandar Abbas just demonstrated has been lost. Somewhere in the operations rooms, beneath Russian Naval High Command, planners who spent 3 months building Maritime Security Belt 2026 as a deterrent demonstration are watching their deterrent be revealed as theater. And the calculation they are making is the same calculation Soviet planners made in November of 1962. The Stoichi is still at Bandar Abbas. The Russian flag is still flying. The press releases will continue to circulate. But everyone who matters has now seen what the deployment actually means in the only test that ever matters, which is the test of whether the deployment changes American behavior. It did not. The U.S. Navy treated the Russian presence as decorative. Iran's symbolic granting of transit rights was overridden without comment. The maritime security belt was not a wall. It was not a barrier. It was not even a meaningful operational consideration. It was a ribbon, and the ribbon was cut by the simple act of Washington proceeding as if it were not there. That is the moment Russian deterrence in the Persian Gulf became permanent past tense. Not because Russia lost a battle. Russia was never given the opportunity to lose a battle. The blockade was enforced. The corvette stayed in port. And the perception that sustained Russian relevance in this body of water, the perception that Moscow could, if pressed, actually impose costs on American maritime operations in the Gulf, was demonstrated to be unsupported by anything Russia was prepared to do in the moment of confrontation. Perceptions, once tested and falsified, do not regenerate by diplomatic statement. They regenerate, if at all, only by the slow and expensive reconstitution of the underlying capabilities that the perception was supposed to represent. Russia does not have that time. Russia does not have those capabilities. And the silence at Bandar Abbas is now permanent, in a way that no Russian ambassador, no Russian press release, and no future maritime security belt exercise can paper over. The era of Russian credibility in the Persian Gulf ended quietly, in a single port, with a single warship that did not sail when the moment came. The U.S. Navy did the unthinkable. The U.S. Navy treated the second largest military in the world as if it were not there. And the truly unthinkable part, the part that historians will mark as the strategic inflection point of this entire conflict, is that the U.S. Navy was correct to do so. Subscribe to this channel right now if you have not. We are tracking every move in this confrontation as it lands, including whatever Moscow does next to try to reverse what Bandar Abbas just demonstrated. Hit the bell, share this video with anyone trying to make sense of why a single silent corvette in an Iranian port is the most important geopolitical event of the month. We will be here when the next move comes. We are always watching.